Now, when you say he was non-committal, do you mean that he wasn't ready to sign a contract? Or when you say he's non-committal, there's two things that I would focus on. One is his willingness to sign a contract. The other would be his willingness to actually work with you. Those are two, I would say, different things. A lot of times, Chinese people are very kind of, they're more interested in how the relationship is going to develop as opposed to what we can agree on that we're going to do right at this moment. So did you feel that he was still very interested in the services that you offer and working with you? I mean, describe what you mean by non-committal. It's just like what I kind of tried to say in this one and also in the past webinar is if you feel that he's non-committal, then it's always also important to try to imagine from his point of view, what does he perceive about you? You know, what would cause him to hesitate or to be non-committal? Is it certain things that you've asked for? Is it certain expectations that you have? You know, what would be the reason? You have to start kind of imagining why he would be non-committal, and then try to figure out how to untangle those questions that he may have in his mind. But generally speaking, of course, I don't know the specifics, but generally speaking, if you can align on process before you align on outcome, that's kind of what we would say that would get the ball rolling, right? No. When I say align on process, it means, are you able to agree on what to do next? It's really just that simple. Um, Obviously, he knows your services. Obviously, he knows the value that your services potentially offer in the market in China. Obviously, he should also know what is the potential for the services that you offer. And he should also know how to market those services to the patients in China, because he is Chinese and he's supposedly he is well connected and he has experience in this healthcare market in China. Otherwise, you wouldn't be talking to him. So if you make all of those assumptions, then basically is to get on the same page. It's basically, well, what is the next step, right? He wouldn't be talking to you this long if he didn't feel working with you, having access to your IP or your services or whatever you're bringing in. He wouldn't be talking to you if he didn't feel that over whatever period of time he's thinking about, he would be able to monetize this partnership with you. I mean, I'm not talking about how you pay him or what kind of commission he gets or what. We're not even talking about money. But in the background, you have to assume that he already sees the possibility that he would be able to make money. Otherwise, he wouldn't be talking to you. You have to assume, because you've been dealing with this guy for so long, that he understands the value proposition and he understands how to access and deliver that value proposition to the end market. Because right now it's just the two of you, right? What you need to align on as far as process is what's next, right? You don't need to talk about price at this point. You don't need to talk about commission structure at this point. You don't even need to talk about, who's going to pay for what and who's going to be responsible for what. What you want to align on first is what's next and what's next after that. And hopefully you can map out what needs to be done before you receive that first order. Whether that order comes directly from a patient or it comes from some kind of service provider, it doesn't really matter. The question is, this is again, circular thinking versus linear thinking, right? In a very linear way, what we want to discuss is what are the things that we need to do in order to get from A to B? And B being getting that first order where somebody actually pays you. Okay. For you, it should be a very sequential way to get from A to B once that's aligned. For him, because he's more Chinese and he's older, he probably doesn't view it in a sequential way. So he may be talking all over the place. And you're probably going to experience that where you can't quite connect this statement with how this is all going to work. Okay, so when I say align on process is just define all the things that need to be done. Don't worry about sequence at the moment. And then if you are driving things, then once you agree on what needs to be done, then you put them in a sequence and drive the process. That would be, yeah, I think right now, because when you say he's non-committal, it's not hard to imagine from his side, he's not sure of the process that you want to follow. And so you guys are talking about, in Chinese, it's called 鸡同鸭讲, which means that, you know, you're not really on the same level talking about the same thing, even though you are talking about the same thing. This is the most challenging thing about communicating with Chinese people is they're talking about one aspect and you're talking about another aspect, and you're actually not connected. You're actually talking through each other or over each other. So the key is just to take a step back and align on process, which means what are the things that you need to ask him, what are the things we need to do to be successful? And then once you agree on the things, then you start doing them. And this is a case where you don't even have to align on the sequence. You just have to align on the tasks. And then in your playbook, you have the sequence, and then you just drive that with your interactions with him. You know, whatever his name is, I think we need to do this now. And then I think we need to do this now. I'm ready to do this. Let's prepare for this. And then you drive it, but you don't make him feel that because his emotions may prioritize things in a more circular manner, you make him believe or feel that, well, that's okay. It could be a false perception that it's not actually okay, but as long as he feels it's okay, it's not difficult to do what he thinks is important and still do other things at the same time, right? And then where you focus your attention will help him kind of move closer in alignment with what you want to do. Yeah, so the example that I gave today, you're not at that stage yet. Because the example that I gave today, we didn't have any disagreement about who invests what. We didn't have any disagreement about who owns what percentage of equity. We actually didn't even have any disagreement about who's responsible for what. Today's discussion was really about teamwork. It wasn't about partnering. The last discussion, the last webinar was about partnering. So what we're talking about in today's session was after you've agreed on all the parameters of how you work together, how do you actually work together? Okay, you're at the stage where you haven't even gotten to the parameters of, you know, how you're going to actually structure the partnership and who's going to be responsible for what. Right. So the best thing to do, and you can always assume that your Chinese counterpart is doing this too, is it's really more advantageous for you to find out exactly where he stands on all the issues you care about. And the only way to do that is to just continuously ask him questions and be curious about what he values and what he thinks and what he wants to do, almost not even revealing where you would draw a line. Okay, this is kind of the art of negotiations in China. It's more about you want to know exactly what he thinks, what he's willing to do, what his expectations would be before you even put your own cards on the table. The natural tendency for most Westerners or most foreigners in China who are entering partner deals is let me be completely transparent. This is what I expect. This is what I need to do. That actually doesn't work in your favor. It's almost counterintuitive how to negotiate a partnership with somebody in China. And it's almost like you'd want to deliberately not be transparent in the initial stages, right? And even when he asks, you just want to, and I think I said this in the past webinars too, is it's almost a danger for you to give very specific yes, no answers to questions. Because a lot of times, culturally, they don't even expect a yes, no answer. They ask you just to kind of know how you feel about something and what you want to present, or the perception that you want to create is that, you're flexible, you're open-minded. And then you want to reverse the conversation back to him, throw the ball back to his court. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? How would you feel about this? Are you able to work under this type of circumstance? Would you be willing to do this? Those are the things that enable you to really assess, can this person be the right partner? And this is what a lot of people just at what they're accustomed to, their standard modus operandi, their standard MO. They're accustomed to, this is how I work. This is what I expect. I want to be completely transparent about what I want to do, and then expect the other person to try to figure out how to work with you. That approach, if you're just looking at things at kind of, I call it the balance of extremes. If you're just looking at these things in the extremes, if you're doing more of what I just said typically foreigners do, you just want to move closer to the center, ask more questions, be more curious, so you can pull him closer to the center, and that's how you meet somewhere in the center. Does that make sense? Right. So you're describing exactly what I'm picturing. And the way to break that cycle is, well, the goal is to be more empathetic, but the behavior is just to ask more questions, right? Because when he is talking, then it becomes not a question of, is he being non-committal to your expectations? Then it becomes figuring out, can you accept what he's willing to commit to? See how there's a difference there? Instead of, yeah, so this is what we call MO, modus operandi. This is your approach. Instead of having the negotiations and trying to get him to commit to something, you flip it around. You find out what he's willing to agree to do, and then decide, can I accept that? Right? So then the burden shifts from whether he can be committed to what you're presenting to whether you can accept what he's willing to do. And then that dynamic completely changes. See how it seems like it's very subtle, but when you're actually in the middle of the negotiations or the discussions, it completely changes the dynamic of how you communicate with one another. Right now, you're putting all the burden on him to commit to things that you think you are very transparent about offering. Flip that around. Find out what he is willing to do, and then decide for yourself, can I accept that? And then just keep on asking different types of questions, different types of scenarios. Don't judge what his answers are. Just always shift gears and say, well, I understand how this may be difficult. Well, how about this? And how about this? And then you can say, because the ultimate goal for us, if we're going to be successful, is this, unless you have a different idea of how you define success or how we can make more money or whatever, right? You want to shift the answering of questions to him, as opposed to you being, I'm giving all this information and then you have to commit to this. It's just one extreme versus another. I actually have something called BOE, balance of extremes, cross-cultural performance analysis. It's where you are and where he's at and how you move closer to the center. And one of the things you have to do is you have to change your own approach or your own MO. And that will help him articulate more what his expectations are. As opposed to you asking him, can you accept this? You would ask him, well, what would be most comfortable for you? Because ultimately, the goals are the same. You want to work together to make money, right? It's just a different way of communicating. Instead of saying, can you accept this? You're asking, what can you accept? Please tell me. And that gives him more opportunity to be more open, right? Your goal when you're partnering with somebody in China is to open them up. The more open they are, the more you can understand whether they are the right partner, and number two, whether they can actually be trusted. If it's always you talking and them just agree or disagree, then you're never going to figure that out. And then what happens is ultimately you do hammer out an agreement, but over time it becomes dysfunctional. Yeah. And if you want to pave the way for a long-term successful partnership, then you want to give the other person a lot more opportunity to articulate how they would be most comfortable partnering with you. And that gives you insight. You want information because you're evaluating him. You just disguise that as being, very curious, very empathetic, very sympathetic to his needs. You disguise that with asking questions, but in the end, you're just trying to do the assessment, right? And you can't really do an assessment saying, okay, I'm transparent. What can you commit to? That doesn't give you really any information at all. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you just need to understand if he were in charge, what would he do? And if you know the answer to that question, you also answer another question that's really important: is he the right partner? Right? Yeah. So you can't get the answer to that question unless you ask.